Gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to thank AIOS for giving me an opportunity to speak in my paper in this forum. I'll be speaking on management of hollowing and herniation of lower lid fat, blepharoplasty versus the filler. No financial interest. We all know that aging leads to sagging of the eyelid tissues with weakening of the orbital septum, thereby producing the classic double convex deformity. This deformity is characterized by the prominence of the orbital ring, the lengthening of the lower lid surface area, and the herniation of the orbital fat. This defect is more prominent medially, which is known as tear trap deformity, and laterally it is known as the hollow eye deformity. So how to solve this problem? The deficient volume needs to be supplemented, which can be addressed both surgically and non-surgically. Traditionally, we know that the blepharoplasty is a subtraction form of surgery that involves the excision of variable amount of skin, muscle, and fat from the eyelids. So what is the best fit solution? It can be either a subperiosteal repositioning of the lower lid fat during the lower lid blepharoplasty or by injection filler in the tear trough in order to level out the playground. So the aim of the present study is to compare the efficacy of the lower lid blepharoplasty with fat repositioning versus injection of hyaluronic acid filler in the management of hollowing and herniation of lower lid fat, and the clearance of medical ethics committee has been taken. This is an intervention comparative study of 22 patients divided into two groups, wherein in group 1, patient had undergone a full lower lid blepharoplasty with a subperiosteal transfer of the lower lid fat, and in group 2, patient had undergone bilateral hyaluronic acid injection into the tear trough. All participants were randomly allocated to either treatment arm through a computer-generated random number sequence and minimized to 11 in each arm, and all operation done between 2009 to 2011. The preoperative evaluation included a thorough ophthalmic evaluation and the evaluation of the annexia, mainly the lids, which includes also the assessment of the medial and the lateral laxity, and the most important being the preoperative documentation, which included the full face, the mid face, the eye box face, and also the tilt photography. So the inclusion and exclusion criteria were as per the prefix pro forma, and in group 1 we had done a bilateral lower lid blepharoplasty wherein we had excised the lateral fat pad, and the medial and the central fat pad has been transferred subperiosteally into the tear trough in order to take care of the tear trough. And in the group 2 we had injected filler. This is a non-animal based synthetic filler which consists of 24 milligram per ml of the hyaluronic acid. The most important thing is that we have to mark the area and go deep within to the subperiosteal region, and it should be injected only while retracting. The connection has gone off. Should I continue?
Yeah.
It has gone off there.
It's not coming there. Central screen, please.
I think I can continue. Yeah, you can see there. Okay. So out of the 22 patients, the mean age was 52 years plus minus 4.2 standard deviation, with more males than female. And we did get good results in the lower lid blepharoplasty, where you can see the tear trough deformity has been taken care of. This is another gentleman where the lower lid blepharoplasty has been done pre and the post-op. You can see the tear trough deformity has been much reduced following the subperiosteal transfer of the fat. This is another lady. And what we have seen that if you transfer the medial and the central fat into the subperiosteal region, then the results are quite permanent and you do not get the recurrences. But these are few of the patients, and then in every patient we had removed the bolsters after the week, and we did follow the patient to a maximum period of 3 years. However, in the group 2, we had seen in both out of the 22 patients, all patients were happy with the lid contour, and 2 patients in group 1 had a lower lid ectropion, and 1 patient had a hollowing due to over-resection of fat pad. And this is the patient, you can see the lower lid ectropion. This is following a lower lid blepharoplasty and the over-resection of fat pad leading to a hollowing of the lids. So in group 2, all patients were happy with the lid contour, but 1 patient had bumpiness in the lower lid, wherein I had to inject the hyaluronidase. And we all know that the hyaluronic acid filler, it lasts for a maximum of 2 to 3 years, so we had to re-inject in 9 of the patient. And this is how we have injected. You go deep to the periosteal region, but it should be always injected while retracting or while withdrawing the needle. These are a few of the patients that you can see. I have already mentioned that one patient had bumpiness, and this is the patient where I had to inject the hyaluronidase in the bump, and this has taken care of the swelling. So I did follow up all the patient with ultrasonography, and yes, you can see here, this is the filler day 1, and this is being reduced in the 6 months, and also this filler being present after the 15 months following the injection. So, and we all know that traditionally the lower lid blepharoplasty, when the fat is removed, it leads to a shrunken and a hollow lid appearance. So, transconjunctival fat repositioning is a better option. The advantage of using the fat is that we are utilizing our autogenous tissue, and it has a long-lasting effect. However, there are multiple reports of using the tear trough as for hyaluronic acid for the treatment of the tear trough. And we have found that in a patient in group 2, 90.9% were happy with the lid contour. The 2 patients had a lower lid ectropion in group 1, and 1 had a bumpiness, however, none had any functional problem. So, in conclusion, these aesthetic results were comparable with both the groups. The hyaluronic acid had the advantage of being an OPD procedure, though it requires repetition, and the surgery gave a more permanent result, but it requires hospitalization. By Google and PubMed search, we found that this intervention comparative starting on the lower lid blepharoplasty with the subperiosteal fat versus the injection filler is one of the early report to find a customer's best fit solution. These are concerns for the presentation. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you, sir.
We'll move on to the next paper, which is an external disease, Demodex infestation in anterior blepharitis, meibomian gland dysfunction, and mixed blepharitis.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, judges and delegates. My topic is Demodex species infiltration in blepharitis. Authors don't have any financial interest. Demodex mite is an external parasite, belongs to the phylum Arthropoda, class Arachnida, order Acarina, can infest the meibomian gland and sebaceous gland. They normally inhabit the hair and eyelash follicles in no numbers. Their overpopulation may lead to lid margin infection, causing ocular surface discomfort and symptoms of like itching, foreign body or stinging sensation. It may also exacerbate the pre-existing anterior blepharitis and posterior blepharitis. Demodex infestation is often overlooked in differential diagnosis in the clinical investigation of blepharitis and may be a cause for treatment failure when not specifically addressed. There are 2 distinct species which are found, Demodex brevis and Demodex folliculorum, and diagnosis of Demodex infestation is very simple, just by epilating the lash follicle and examining under light microscopy. This study determined the incidence and density of Demodex species found on the eyelashes of subjects with normal subjects, patients with anterior blepharitis, meibomian gland dysfunction, and mixed blepharitis. The study population was consecutive patients who consulted our hospital, Shankara Eye Center, Coimbatore, for a period of 3 months with a diagnosis of meibomian gland dysfunction, anterior blepharitis, and mixed blepharitis. We had 50 age-matched controls who consulted our hospital for other reasons. Institutional review board permission and the informed consent was taken before conducting the study. This was the diagnostic criteria for meibomian gland dysfunction, anterior blepharitis, and mixed blepharitis. The exclusion criteria were use of any topical ophthalmic medications over 3 months, except for artificial tears, history of ocular or eyelid trauma, a previous diagnosis of chemical burns, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and OCP, and eyelid malposition like entropion, ectropion, and signs of active ocular infection or inflammation other than blepharitis. Parameters that were evaluated were ocular symptomatology and clinical findings. All digital photographs of the lid margins were taken, and lash sampling was done by epilating forceps. And the total number of Demodex were identified per lash. This is the light microscopy picture showing the Demodex on the single lash follicle. There are different images. So age distribution of our patients studied, where most of our patients belong to the 40 to 60 and 60 to 80 age group, constituting almost about 50 to 60% of our cases. These were combined with the age-matched controls. The incidence of Demodex in patients in the 2 group studies was the high rate of Demodex infestation in symptomatic patients, close to 78.7%. And also in control patients which didn't have any complaints had almost incidence of 36%. So incidence of Demodex according to the different diagnosis in symptomatic patient, incidence of Demodex were more associated with anterior blepharitis and mixed blepharitis with a p-value of 0.01. And comparison, this table shows a comparison between ocular symptomatology and density of Demodex. As you can see, maximum infestation of 3 to 5 or 6 to 8 mites were with irritation and itchiness. And the most striking feature in this table shows the dandruff-like material or cylindrical dandruff shows the highest percent of mites, 3 to 5 and 6 to 8 mites. So the random errors which usually come in the potential errors are random appellation of lashes leads in a lower count. Also the Demodex tends to float away, and Demodex embedded in the cylindrical fragments could not be counted, and some cylindrical dandruff fragments that harbored Demodex still were adhered to the lid skin. So what we did is a modified way of counting Demodex. We epilated the lashes with only cylindrical dandruff, used carrier slides with concavity, and put a drop of saline instead of alcohol and placed a cover slip. This prevented the Demodex to float away, and also the count was accurate. This was the carrier slide we used. I'll just show you the video demonstrating Demodex. This is a light microscopy of a single follicle, hair lash follicle, showing the Demodex which are live. This is a one organism. In this slide, I will show you close to the 5 to 6 mites. This is the cutting apparatus of the mite. So, coming to the discussion, the lid irritation is the most commonest finding associated with Demodex. The possible mechanism would be the biting apparatus of the parasite or the lipolytic enzyme secreted by the enzyme, which causes accumulation and blockage of sebaceous glands, and secondary or concomitant microbial blepharitis. This study demonstrated a high incidence and density of Demodex density in patients with mixed blepharitis followed by anterior blepharitis. So, lid irritation and cylindrical dandruff are indicative of high density count. So, take-home message is patients with recurrent blepharitis not responding to current treatment should always be investigated and treated for Demodex infestation. Thank you.
Dr. Anita, any question? You yourself have mentioned in an earlier paper for the Rangachari, there was this finding that Demodex in almost 75 to 78% of normal people also would have Demodex.
Not normal, sir. It's symptomatic. Normal will have around 30.
Normal symptomatic patients will have Demodex. What is the treatment you advocate for this?
Tea tree oil application, sir. 20% tea tree oil application. We at our center have started all these patients on tea tree oil local application, 20%, 3 times a day for 1 month.
And is it available or are you making it yourself?
We are making, the tea tree oil comes in 100% solution, sir. We are diluting it to 20% by mixing coconut oil. 100% tea tree oil is readily available in the markets.
What is there in the literature regarding this?
Tea tree oil.
In the literature regarding Demodex and the treatment?
What previous literatures I mentioned for treatment is petroleum jelly, sir. Local application of petroleum jelly and ivermectin. But we tried the tea tree oil and we got good results.
Last 2 years, papers are all on tea tree oil. 20% tea tree oil for Demodex. Yeah. Okay, thank you. We move on to the next paper on the sensitivity and specificity of non-mydriatic digital imaging in screening for diabetic retinopathy. Sorry.
Respected chairpersons and dear friend, very good morning. My topic is sensitivity and specificity of non-mydriatic digital imaging in screening diabetic retinopathy in Indian eyes. No financial disclosures. Diabetic retinopathy, as we all know, is a major public health burden in India, and blindness is the most feared complication, mainly because of lack of awareness, both among the patients as well as the physicians. However, it is largely preventable by an early detection and treatment, and for this, we need to screen all the patients who are diagnosed with diabetes. The non-mydriatic fundus cameras have been in use over the last 25 years, and in the US and Europe, regular screening of diabetic retinopathy using non-mydriatic fundus camera is being widely recommended. But when it comes to Indian eyes, we don't have the answer. We all get carried away by the fancy gadgets and the high-tech imaging techniques that are very much in vogue in ophthalmology these days, especially when recommended by the Western world. But when we have to invest them in our own setup, we have to be ensured, we must know how robust they are when it comes to our own people, our own population with dark iris. So this is precisely the objective of my study, was to evaluate the sensitivity and specificity of non-mydriatic digital imaging as a screening tool in detecting diabetic retinopathy in Indian eyes. We recruited prospectively 500 patients attending the endocrinology department of PGI diagnosed with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. All those patients who were already under the care of a retina specialist were excluded from the study. The non-mydriatic camera was installed in the endocrinology department and was operated by a trained ophthalmic technician who performed 3 45-degree retinal field images, 3 each in color and 3 each in red-free, and then the eyes were dilated, and then the patients were directed to the Advanced Eye Center for dilated fundus photography. 2 experienced retina specialists independently graded the images for the quality of the photograph using the grading system proposed by Higgs et al. And severity of diabetic retinopathy as per the ALI House classification of ETDRS. The gold standard were the grades of diabetic retinopathy as seen by the dilated fundus imaging. The mean age was 53 years, and this is what we found. Almost 1/3, that is 36.6% of the patients had ungradable images in one or both the eyes by the observer 1, and so did the observer 2, 31%. The sensitivities were 58.8% and 57.3% respectively, specificity 69.1 and 68.3, and so were the positive and negative predictive values. This table shows the level of mismatch between the undilated and the dilated fundus imaging by observer 1 as seen by the numbers in red. This shows the mismatch by observer 2. Let me show you an example of a 57-year-old male. The anterior segment pictures. When we do the non-mydriatic imaging, we have a grade 4 image. We cannot really comment upon the status of diabetic retinopathy by this, but when we dilate him and do his imaging, he has a grade 1 image and no diabetic retinopathy. This table shows the level of agreement between observer 1 and observer 2 is also seen by a high kappa value of 0.96. And this is an interesting example. A 41-year-old male, the anterior segment pictures, and when we do his non-mydriatic imaging, we see nothing. It's a grade 5 image. When we do a dilated imaging, he has a grade 1 image and a sight-threatening diabetic macular edema. Further, when the patient is subjected to a fluorescein angiogram, he has a proliferative disease as well. So we found low sensitivities by the non-mydriatic imaging, while the accepted target for an effective screening program is 80%. We also found a higher rate of ungradable images, about 31%, than that reported by majority of the studies earlier. Now, what could be the reason for this? Bergman et al. Have shown an increased pupillary contraction, a faster contraction, and a prolonged pupillary contraction in the brown iris group as compared to the blue iris group, indicating a stronger pupillary light reflex, and patients with brown iris have been found to be more discomforted by the flash as compared to the ones with blue iris. So we observed that although majority of the eyes do not need dilatation for adequate quality retinal images to detect diabetic retinopathy, a significant proportion of the patients that did not have any diabetic retinopathy underwent unnecessary ophthalmic referral just because they had ungradable images in one or both the eyes, as seen by my first patient. And we also missed sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy in some of the eyes, as shown by the second example. So the acquisition of image quality without the use of dilators needs to be validated in Indian eyes before this technology can be used as a widespread tool for implementation in national screening programs to curb the problem of diabetic retinopathy in our population. To conclude, a relatively lower sensitivity and a high rate of poor quality photographs of the non-mydriatic digital camera pose a major limitation in its usefulness as a perfect screening tool for diabetic retinopathy, particularly in Indian eyes with dark iris. Thank you very much.
did you compare different non-mediated, now that there is a choice, besides the Zeiss, there are 2 or 3 others which claim superior, each one claims superiority over the other.
Yes, they do claim, but I don't have the experience because we don't have the other
You have not
cameras.
compared
So this is a non-comparative study.
Okay. Any other questions? Because it's an eye-opener to know that what is being touted sometimes by companies doesn't work as well as in Indian eyes.
Sorry? No, we didn't grade the cataract because when it comes to screening of the population, you really cannot segregate a patient just because he has cataract. We cannot screen. So screening is basically to detect any patient who has a sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy and needs an adequate ophthalmic referral. No, one thing I would like to highlight, when I showed you the anterior segment pictures, this anterior segment pictures were taken by this camera itself. So this showed us the gross cataract, any advanced cataract, or any corneal opacity which could help us to exclude that patient, and which we did. So the normal, senile, immature cataracts cannot be excluded from here.
You've excluded the mature cataracts from this study?
No, anyone which had very significant cataract, which you can see there's no glow, or the corneal opacities, otherwise no.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We go to the next paper on ocular pathology, orbital histiocytic lesions.
I'll start. Good morning, respected faculty on the dais and my dear colleague. So I'll be speaking about clinico-pathological profile of orbital histiocytic lesion. This was a study conducted at AIIMS. We have no financial interest or relationships to disclose. As we all know, orbital histiocytic disorder have a varied clinical presentation, and orbital involvement is quite rare and the diagnosis can often be challenging. Now, the spectrum of orbital histiocytic disorder includes Langerhans cell histiocytosis, Rosai-Dorfman syndrome, juvenile xanthogranuloma, Erdheim-Chester disease, and necrobatic xanthogranuloma, out of which majority is included by Langerhans cell histiocytosis and Rosai-Dorfman syndrome, and sporadic cases of Erdheim-Chester disease, juvenile xanthogranuloma, and necrobatic xanthogranuloma have been reported. But there is no study on Asian patient encompassing the entire spectrum of orbital histiocytic lesion, and only one study by Shields et al. In Caucasian population describing the entire spectrum of orbital histiocytosis. So we thought to report the clinical profile of histiocytic lesion of the orbit that were diagnosed at our center, and hence to describe the role of histopathology and immunohistochemistry in diagnosing orbital histiocytic lesion. This was a retrospective case series study done at RP Center, AIIMS, New Delhi from 2003 to 2013. Medical records of cases with proven orbital histiocytosis between these periods were reviewed. Their demographic clinical imaging features were studied, and they were also reviewed for histopathological finding and immunohistochemical stain, particularly CD1A S100 protein and CD68. We had 11 cases, out of which 6 were female. The mean age was 21 years, and 6 of the cases were in the pediatric age group, that is less than 16. The mean duration of symptom was 24 months. The abaxial proptosis was the most common presenting clinical feature. Bilateral orbital involvement was seen in 4 cases. Systemic lymph node was seen in 4 cases, and the supratemporal orbit was the most common location. Now coming on to the result, individually we had 5 cases of LCH, 5 cases of Rosai-Dorfman, and 1 case of Erdheim-Chester disease. So this is the patient with Langerhans cell histiocytosis, where you can see this expansile osteolytic lesion also on CT scan. On FNAC, this patient shows these Langerhans cells, and these cells were positive for CD1A on immunohistochemistry. This is another patient with right eye periorbital swelling, and he on X-ray showed osteolytic lesion of the flat bones like the pelvic bone and the skull bone. On histopathology, he had a monomorphic Langerhans cell with a grooved nuclei, and the ISC showed this brown strong CD1A and S100 positivity in all the cases. So Langerhans cell histiocytosis, as we all know, has an evidence of that lacks the histological evidence of malignancy but behaves in an aggressive manner. The average age of onset is around 1 to 3 years, and the lesional cell exhibit positive staining with S100 and CD1A. Now coming on to the RDD, this is the patient with bilateral proptosis, diffuse involvement of the orbit. There was a mild hepatosplenomegaly with these paravertic lymph nodes and hilar lymph nodes. This patient responded quite well to 3 doses of steroid, and you can see the drastic improvement after 3 days. This patient on histopathology had sheets of histiocytes with vesicular nuclei, Empyropoliosis, that is erythrophagocytosis, was identified in some of these cells, and this brown CD68 positive immunostain was seen in these cases. This Rosai-Dorfman is mostly seen in children and young adults, and the presence of empyropoliosis that expresses S100 along with CD68 positivity is considered diagnostic. Now coming on to the last subset, that is Erdheim-Chester disease, we had just one case with a bilateral proptosis. This patient on histopathology had this foamy histiocytosis, and it was positive for CD68, but notable is that the patient has S100 negativity. So Erdheim-Chester disease is a very rare non-familiar form of disease which has lipid-laden macrophages and with an inflammatory background, along with CD68 positivity, but the negativity of CD1A and S100 is quite diagnostic. So there were no study in Asian literature which encompasses the entire spectrum. So what we thought to compare the individual disease with the series available in the literature. So there was one series available by Herwig et al. That included 5 patients. Our series also had 5 patients. The median age and the sex ratio was comparable. The median duration in our series was slightly more. We don't have any patient with systemic involvement in our series, and the S100 and CD1A was positive in almost all the patients in our series, but the report were not available in their series in 2 and 3 patients respectively. Now coming on to RDD, there was only one series by Geeta Vemuganti et al. From LVPI, which included 7 patients of Rosai-Dorfman syndrome. Our series also had 5 patients. The median age in our series was more, and the median duration of symptom was also 9 months. And considerably, the CD68 positivity in our series was 100%. They have not done the CD68 stain. Hence, to conclude, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first study on Asian patient describing the entire spectrum of orbital histiocytic lesion. Langerhans-Sale histiocytosis and Rosai-Dorfman disease were the most common orbital histiocytic lesion in our experience. For the diagnosis of orbital histiocytosis, clinical and radiological features are definitely helpful, but the characteristic light microscopic feature along with the immunohistochemistry is the key for establishing the exact diagnosis. And a strong clinical suspicion along with a close coordination with the pathologist is definitely necessary for accurate diagnosis of orbital histiocytic lesion. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
That last slide belongs to me.
Yes, sir, I know. That's what I was going to say, just to keep
Thank
the
you.
humor alive.
Okay. Any questions? We move on to the next paper.
Thank you.
Ophthalmic education. Patent in ophthalmology. Dr. Sanjay Chaudhary. Is Dr. Sanjay Chaudhary here? We call the next paper lacrimal dacryoendoscopic guided canalicular nasolacrimal duct recanalizations. Not there, okay. We go to the next paper, pediatric higher order aberrations, the second refractive error in residual ametropic and anisometropic amblyopia. Dr. Mihir Kothari from Mumbai.
Good morning, friends.
It's important.
I'm presenting higher order aberrations, the second or unrecognized refractive error in patients who have isoemetropic and or anisometropic amblyopia. Absolutely no financial interest in anything presented in this paper. Amblyopia is a very common cause of visual impairment in children, and of course anisoemetropic or isoemetropic amblyopia are the commonest kind of amblyopias that you see in children. And despite of the best of your efforts, timely treatment, extended treatment with 100% compliance, there is a small group of children who still do not achieve their best vision over the time. In such patients, we were looking for any other associated abnormality which can explain at least, if not complete visual loss, at least partial visual loss. We came across this paper by Dr. Amar Agarwal, and the findings he reported were too good to believe, wherein the higher order aberration got corrected, producing in 6.25% patients improvement of vision by 1 line, in 31% patients improvement of 2 lines, in 37% patients improvement of 3 lines, and 25% patients in his study had an improvement of 4 lines immediately after doing laser surgery. and it could be correlated in his study with the pre and post-op root mean square values. We were again happily surprised by this particular paper by Dr. K.K. Mehta, wherein at 1 week post-operatively in patients who had unilateral anisometropic amblyopia, the best corrected visual acuity really improved to an unbelievable amount of 4 lines. Of course, there was no record of aberrations pre and post-op analysis, magnification factor was not assessed, and also the learning effect was not mentioned, and all of this, both these studies were done in adults. So we went back to the literature and we found Applegate from Houston, who has done this similar kind of a study and showed significant improvement in best corrected visual acuity, but root mean square values had not correlated with the improvement. However, he did do the contact lens trial preoperatively to make sure that this improvement is not explained by the magnification that takes place in myopic LASIK. We then switched our focus to pediatric studies, and we found in American Journal of Ophthalmology, in Journal of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus, in IOVS, and of course one Chinese study using the Chinese instrument showing a significant improvement in visual acuity in patients who have an isometropic amblyopia and a good association of higher order aberration. So we started this study to assess the higher order aberration in children who had normal vision with or without ametropia, and amblyopic patients who had either ametropic amblyopia or anisometropic amblyopia. We included children between 4 and 16 years of age who were cooperative for complete examination, including the wavefront analysis. And of course, these children were diagnosed to have isoametropic amblyopia or anisoametropic amblyopia with a visual acuity loss of 2 or more lines, having 100% compliance to spectacle wear and or patching, whichever was required, and the maximum patching was done for an extended period of time, at least 6 months after experiencing no further improvement. They were included in the study. None of the patients who could have had vision loss other than the optical abnormality was included in the study. We removed strabismic or deprivational amblyopics, nystagmus, or any other ocular comorbidity or neurological impairment. After complete ophthalmic examination, eye trace analysis was performed, and the analysis of higher order aberrations as well as the Z values for 6 higher order aberrations was included, and a two-tailed t-test was performed to find the significance between the two groups. So we had 33 eyes, total 85 eyes of 46 patients, with 33 distributed as having hypermetropia, myopia, or emetropia. They all had normal best corrected visual acuity, and amblyopic 13 eyes, of which 6 had ametropic amblyopia and 7 had anisometropic amblyopia. The total higher order aberrations were in the range of 0.2 to 0.25 or 0.3. This is what is reported even for the adults. However, it was significantly higher for ametropic amblyopes as well as for anisometropic amblyop, as you see over here. The Wernicke coefficient in normal, that means normal emetropes as well as normal ametropes, was up to 4th order. There was absolutely no difference between the internal or external aberrations or corneal aberrations. And the 5th order pentafoils as well as all 6th order aberrations were higher in internal aberrations rather than corneal level. This is something different than what is reported in the past literature. Z comparison of ametropic amblyopes with normal revealed a higher amount of 4th order tetrafoil, which probably is the most important aberration, which is higher in patients with amblyopia. None of the 27 corneal higher order aberrations were high in patients with anisometropic amblyopia, and all internal optic aberration, higher order aberrations in anisometropic amblyopia were statistically significantly higher. So in conclusion, this is the first case series from India. This is the series which discusses about the normal, what is normal in ametropic patients, emetropic children, and we have used an eye trace system. Higher order aberration was found to be similar to what is reported in adults. Lenticular aberrations were significantly higher in amblyopic patients. They were not corneal, and hence from 3rd to 6th order you need to look at the lenticular aberrations in these patients. Higher order aberration to us seems to be a new refractive error that need to be recognized in amblyopia patients who just don't respond to the conventional treatment, and it may be worth correcting it using certain technologies such as this, where you can demonstrate improvement in the these are aberration minimizing but not neutralizing spectacles. And it does correlate very well with the refractive visual outcomes as well as the higher order aberrations. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Mihir, how did you correct this? With spectacles, with lasers, with lenses?
Sir, we are correcting them with the help of eye scriptions, which are Zeiss surface modified lenses.
Contact lenses.
Essentially the spectacle lenses.
Spectacle lenses.
Yes,
Surface modified to reduce aberrations.
Yes, sir.
No, one question, Mihir. Did you have a similar population of emetropia and who were not amblyogenic and compared the aberrations vis-a-vis, like any?
Yes, sir. There was no
No,
difference
I
between.
just wanted to know whether these aberrations are amblyogenic, because in our study he shows considerable improvement after correction even at a later part of life.
Sure, sir. There was absolutely no difference in myopics, hypermetropics, and normal, that means emetropic. All three, when they had best corrected visual acuity of 6/6, refractive state did not really matter about the higher order
So
aberration.
the same aberrations are present in patients who are getting full vision and patients who have certain amount of amblyopia.
No, sir. Essentially, patients who have normal vision, we did not find higher incidence of higher order aberration being high. But all patients who had amblyopia, whether they are myopic or hypermetropic, they had higher amount of higher order aberration in the range of 0.5 to 0.6.
Did you find any difference between the two eyes in amblyopic patients?
We included the anisometropic amblyopic patients, and we found when we compared the more amblyopic eye of the anisometropic amblyopic patient with their other eye, the other eye had higher amount of higher order aberration when you compare it with the normal who did not have any amblyopia. So,
No, in patients who are not, who had no obvious cause for amblyopia, that means not the anisometropic patients. In those, was there a difference in the two eyes in the
yes, sir.
aberrant?
There was a difference in even in patients who have anisometropic amblyopia, with one eye anisometropic amblyopia, other eye being normal. But even the normal eye has a higher aberration when you compare with absolutely normal people.
No. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Mihir. We move on to the paper in refractive surgery, transepithelial PTK.
Respected panel and dear friends, I am going to take it further where I have left. Now we are going to discuss the long-term studies of simultaneous conventional PRK with collagen cross-linkage for pellucid marginal degeneration, a prospective pilot study. We don't have any financial interest. Pellucid marginal corneal degeneration, as we all understand, is a progressive, non-inflammatory, ectatic corneal disorder that leads to inferior corneal concentric thinning, its protrusion and gradual visual decline, especially because of very high against the rule astigmatism. It is proved beyond doubt that collagen cross-linking has been successful in stabilizing cornea mechanically and halting progression of various corneal ectatic disorders such as PMD, keratoconus and post-LASIK ectasia. However, now we realize that many of these post-CXL patients do not achieve visual acuity improvement sufficient to provide functional vision to the patient, and that is especially when they cannot tolerate contact lenses or even in some patients even spectacles, and that is basically because of remnant, regular, very high regular and irregular astigmatism. Quinones from our group was the first to report the combination of simultaneous topographic aided PRK with collagen cross-linkage to address this component and improve the corneal irregularity in keratoconus. And in the same year, similar combination therapy was also applied to a single case of PMD, in which we reported a case which showed significant improvement in uncorrected and corrected visual acuity and also in topographic values after simultaneous topographic aided PRK with collagen cross-linkage. However, since that time, what we have realized that a few of these patients of PMD, they actually demonstrate a fairly regular, although a very, very high astigmatism, and have potential of good best corrected, spectacle best corrected visual acuity. However, they may be spectacle intolerant, especially if they have anisometropia or very, very high astigmatism, or they also can have RGP intolerance. And the basic question here is, can we actually rationalize the use of conventional PRK with collagen cross-linkage to be an effective treatment in this subset of patients? So my purpose here is to present visual, refractive and topographic outcomes of conventional PRK with CXL for progressive PMD with spectacle and contact lens intolerance. This study was conducted under the IRB approval in prospective interventional manner as a pilot study in which progressive PMD with a relatively good potential for best spectacle corrected visual acuity, non-tolerance of spectacles because of either an isometropia or very high astigmatism, and thinnest pachymetry being more than 450 microns were chosen, and they were subjected to combination treatments in which epithelium was removed by transepithelial PTK, which was immediately followed by conventional PRK with Allegretto wave-light excimer laser up to maximum of 40 microns of ablation and optical zone of only 5.5 millimeters, which was again immediately followed by a standard resident protocol collagen cross-linkage. Visual, refractive and topographic outcomes were evaluated along with endothelial cell density pre-operatively and at 1, 3, 6 and 12 months post-operatively in all the cases. Total of 48 eyes have undergone cross-linking. However, out of which 8 eyes of 6 patients have been enrolled and they underwent the combination therapy of PTK PRK with CXL with 1 year of follow-up. As we can see here from this chart, all the parameters including the spherical equivalent, the corneal astigmatism and the uncorrected visual acuity statistically significantly improved after the combination. However, the best corrected visual acuity did not show that pattern. It can also get reflected on this graph. As we can see here, the mean uncorrected visual acuity improved significantly at all post-operative intervals and most dramatically at the first follow-up. And it went on to improve because of continued flattening and regularizing effect of collagen cross-linking per se from approximately 1 logmar units to 0.4 logmar units at 12 months post-operatively, while the mean best spectacle corrected visual acuity was fairly stable and mild improvement was seen at the end of 12 months of follow-up. 12.5% of the eyes were having a good 20 by 60 or better uncorrected visual acuity pre-operatively, which improved to 85% of the eyes having 618 or better on Snellens. None of the eyes lost more than 1 line of best corrected vision, where 30% of the eyes actually gained 1 or more lines of best corrected visual acuity. There were no intra or post-operative complications. The endothelial cell density did not show any significant difference. There were none of the eyes actually showed progression over the follow-up of 1 year. We chose to perform conventional PRK instead of topography-guided PRK in this subset of patients because these were PMD patients with good potential for best corrected visual acuity. As we understand, the pre-operative best spectacle corrected activity was adequate in order to provide functional vision to these patients. And on the contrary, topography-guided PRK is usually performed in patients who have irregular astigmatism and decreased best spectacle visual acuity. In conventional PRK, as we all understand, the ablation is substantially lesser as compared to the topography-guided PRK for the similar kind of refractive correction and is also more predictable. As we can see here from this 46-year-old female's left eye topographies, she had 6 diopters of against the rule astigmatism, underwent the combination therapy, and landed up with only 2 diopters of the astigmatism. Her best corrected visual acuity was having very good potential, and the uncorrected visual acuity improved from 660 to 612 so as to improve her spectacle tolerance and can use spectacles very well now. The simultaneous PTK PRK combined with CXL seemed to be an effective and safe promising treatment for management of selected PMD patients. Larger patient series with longer follow-ups are definitely necessary to evaluate the outcomes of this combination therapy, which we have just validated in our pilot study. I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you so much.
Any questions? No? Yes, Dr. Anita Panda.
I just want to know, the defect in PMD is at periphery. Defect in PMD is at periphery.
Yes, ma'am.
Action of CXL is in center.
Yes, ma'am.
How best it can correct? I just want to know the mechanism.
Yes. Ma'am, actually in this subset of patients in PMD as a standardized proforma, what we do is actually we remove the epithelium in epithelium of Dresden protocol slightly eccentrically inferiorly. So basically, like in keratoconus, we usually center it around the corneal apex. Here it is actually taken inferiorly so as to give maximum amount of energy to be delivered and riboflavin delivery to the area which is defective as in PMD, which is inferior. And also, while we are doing the centration of the cross-linking UVA radiation per se, we slightly decenter it slightly inferiorly and ask the patient to actually keep the chin slightly up so that it actually focuses on the inferior portion of the cornea.
No, slightly decenter means it has to be scientific. One patient you will say scientific, slightly decenter, it may be 9 degree, other one will be 6 degree. Even keratoconus also, it is not central. Keratoconus is also eccentric. But PMD is entirely, it is at the near the limbus.
Yes, yes.
So that's why my question.
Yes, yes. I mean, it was kept eccentric as much as possible. It was difficult to standardize exactly how many millimeters eccentric. However, we just made sure that the limbus was not irradiated because it also kills the limbus stem cells. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. We move on to the next paper on squint, modified Yokoyama surgery for heavy eye syndrome. Yeah.
Thanks. And good morning, all. This is a single case report of modified Yokoyama surgery for heavy eye syndrome. No financial interest. A 65-year-old lady presented with gradual progressive inward deviation of both eyes for past 6 years. History of defective vision in both eyes since childhood was there. Both eyes, some ocular surgeries were done few years back, the details of which was not available. This is the clinical photo of the patient. No history of systemic illness like thyroid, collagen vascular disease, diabetes or hypertension. Vision in right eye was not recordable. Vision in left eye was finger counting with large feston and great difficulty. Hotspot test both a large angle esotropia. Severe limitation of all gauges with eyes fixed in adduction. Post-adduction test was positive for abduction in both eyes. And fourth generation test showed moderate LR tuck. Slit lamp examination did not reveal any conjunctival scarring, ruling out any prior squint surgery. However, left eye cornea and PCI IOL was partially seen, indicating cataract surgery with IOL was done. Detailed slit lamp examination, orthoptic examination and fundoscopy are not feasible at that moment. Ultrasound B scan did not reveal any gross posterior segment abnormality. Preoperative 9-gauge photos looks like a copy-paste of one another, severe limitation of all gauges. With this clinical picture, we came to the differential diagnosis. Might be bilateral seasonal palsy, might be Graves' ophthalmopathy, the great mimicker of all squint entities. Might be convergent spasm, however, it is short span, short-lived only. Divergence palsy comes with other CNS entities, and infantile esotropia, very remote chance, or it can be bilateral high myopia with myopic strabismus fixus. With this, we went ahead with the MRI scan. T2 weighted image, 3 mm slice coronal section of the MRI scan. It showed the pathology, that is the globe was dislocated out of the muscle cone. We can see here the SR is more medially deviated, the lateral rectus is more inferiorly deviated, and there is crowding of muscles here, and the globe is dislocated. Similar picture in the other eye. So this is a more clear view. This is animation. The superrectus, instead of being here, it has been deviated. The vector path has been deviated. And the lateral rectus, instead of being here, the vector force has been deviated. And here comes something called angle of dislocation of the globe, which is formed by joining 3 points. One is centroid of the superrectus, second is centroid of the globe, and third is centroid of the lateral rectus. When it is more than 180 degree, it's obvious of what we call heavy eye syndrome. Then some light on progressive esotropia caused by high myopia. Presence of high myopia with axial length sometimes greater than 30 mm. Abduction and elevation are limited, and post-adduction test is positive. Leads to esotropia fixus in some cases. So we confirmed our diagnosis to be acquired large angle esotropia with globe dislocation, also known as heavy eye syndrome. We went ahead with the surgery, left eye followed by right eye. After blood investigations and physician clearance, this is the left eye surgery. Post-adduction test is positive for abduction. We can see here very thin and friable medial rectus. Utmost care was taken, still the muscle gave way in between, also known as pulled into syndrome. Here we can see the lateral rectus more inferiorly, indicated by the yellow line. Here we can see the inferior rectus, it is the lateral rectus, both of them looking like parallel to one another. And here we can see the superior rectus, it is more medially deviated. This animation shows that the muscle split was done starting from point of insertion till past equator. This is more important, this past equator. Then after appropriate measurement, fibropolyester suture was used and myopexy was done. So this is our preoperative photograph, And post-operatively, after left eye surgery, after 4 months of left eye surgery, we went as the other eye surgery. This is the post-operative photograph. Post-operative 9 gauge shows significant improvement in movement in all gauges. Vision in right eye was 6/18 with +1 diopter spherical only in spite of being a aphakic eye. We can see here some vitreous strands are there in the pupillar area and the PA is done. And left eye vision was 6/12 best corrected. Fundus, both eyes show high myopic fundus. And axial length, right eye was 32.12 and left eye was 32.04. So this high myopia was the reason for 6/18 vision with +1 only in spite of being aphakic. And there was no evidence of anterior segment ischemia. So the surgical procedure that we did, this animation shows that longitudinal splitting of lateral rectus and superior rectus and union of lateral half of superior rectus and superior half of lateral rectus muscle bellies with scleral fixation, also known as modified Yokoyama surgery. Other possible surgical procedures explained in literature are recession or tenotomy of the medial rectus, loop myopexy, Yamada's procedure, Yokoyama's procedure. So the variables to evaluate the results of surgery are angle of ocular deviation, angle of abduction and angle of dislocation. All three were improved in our case. In conclusion, in cases of progressive large angle azial deviation, the mechanism, that is globe dislocation after the muscle cone, should be addressed and MRI is the diagnostic modality. A surgical procedure to bind the superior and lateral rectus muscles was effective and it worked by restoring the dislocated eyeball back into the muscle cone. Recession and resection is not the solution for all azeotropia. The take-home message is, in heavy eye syndrome with globe dislocation, modified Yokoyama surgery is recommended and caution should be taken if medial rectus is tight and fragile. And obviously, these two photos. These are my references. Thank you. The limitation is a single case only is the limitation of our study.
How do you decide between a Jensen's and a Hammersheim's in these cases?
This is a hemi-Jensen procedure only because the globe is dislocated. So if you don't do a myopexy, the chance of recurrence is there. Even some authors, they have operated one eye and in the next eye they are doing the scleral fixation because they noticed that when they did not do the scleral fixation, the recurrence was there because the knot may slip. So you have to fixate it, hemi-Jensen with fixation only.
Okay. Any other question? Thank you, Dr. Shetty. The last paper on trauma, Dr. Samrat Chatterjee. Visual outcome and prognostic factors in management of traumatic cataract with an open globe.
Good morning. We do not have any financial interest to disclose. The challenging issue when we are dealing with a traumatic cataract in a setting of open globe injury requires restoration of the ocular coat integrity. You need to remove the damaged lens and also think about the visual rehab. And at the same time, you need to control inflammation and prevent glaucoma and infection. So the aim of this present study was to report the visual outcome and to identify the prognostic factors after managing traumatic cataract in an open globe setting. This was a retrospective interventional non-comparative case series, and we included all patients with corneal tear, scleral tear, and traumatic cataract, excluding those who presented with endophthalmitis or those who had already had undergone primary repair elsewhere. The protocol that we followed was initial primary repair of all corneal and scleral laceration, and the surgeon on the table decided on the basis of intraoperative corneal clarity and the integrity of lens capsule whether to do a primary cataract surgery at the same sitting or to defer the cataract surgery at a later date. There was a bias in this study towards deferring the surgery to a later date, and I'll allude to that in the subsequent slides. The post-operative management included frequent topical steroid antibiotics, and the corneal sutures were removed at 3 months, and we did a final outcome evaluation at 6 months, which was a good outcome, was considered if the best corrected spectacle visual acuity was 20/40 or better, and a poor outcome, it was worse than 20/40. And we then looked at the prognostic factors and did a univariate analysis, and factors that were statistically significant. In the univariate analysis, we put them in a multiple logistic model to look for independent variables as risk factors and prognostic factors. So there were a total of 83 patients, and we excluded 18 because they had presented with endophthalmitis or they were lost to follow-up. And ultimately we analyzed 65 patients. And these were mostly males and young adults. And of these patients, all of them had undergone a primary repair, as I had already mentioned. 28% underwent a primary cataract surgery, 28% underwent a lensectomy and no IOL was implanted in them, and 45% of patients underwent a secondary cataract surgery. IOL in the same setting was placed in 18 eyes, and in those that had undergone vitrectomy, and in some cases, in 2% of cases and 8% of cases, we could not implant an IOL. The procedure of choice that we had was 12% had undergone phacoemulsification. Majority, 60% underwent lens aspiration with a Simcoe cannula, and in 28% an automated vitreous cutter was employed. This is a scatter plot that shows the pre- and post-operative visual acuity after the cataract surgery, and this had significantly improved following the cataract removal and visual rehab. The final best corrected visual acuity was in 57% better than 20/40 as our outcome definitions, and in rest 57% of patients we had a poor visual outcome. The prognostic factors like age, gender, the size of the corneal wound, the placement of an intraocular lens, the integrity of the posterior capsule, the presence of glaucoma or intense inflammation postoperatively or astigmatism were not found to be significant prognostic factors in our univariate analysis. And when we examined, and then we found that primary versus secondary cataract surgery had a better outcome in the univariate analysis. When there was posterior segment involvement like retinal detachment, vitreous hemorrhage, macular scar, and traumatic choroidopathy, these patients had a poor outcome in the univariate analysis. And in those where the corneal laceration encroached into the visual axis, as expected, the visual outcome was poor. And when we included these three prognostic factors in a multiple logistic model, we found that corneal laceration that involved the visual axis and the posterior segment complications were significantly correlated to the final outcome. Now, when we compared our visual outcome results with the other published studies of the similar nature, we found that it was quite comparable, neither too high, neither too less. And in the prognostic factors, there were very few case series or studies that had actually examined it in an evidence-based method with a multiple logistic model. And in those that had done so with some attempt, amblyopia and retinal detachment were significant in the pediatric age group, corneal scar, irregular astigmatism, and the patient age also in some other studies. While in our studies, we found that a corneal tear that encroached into the visual axis or posterior segment complications to be significantly associated. One issue that a surgeon faces is whether you need to remove the cataract at the time of primary surgery. There are pros and cons to that and to defer the surgery for a second. Our study, because of a retrospective nature and difficulty in having actually a randomization which depended on the surgeon and on the decision at the operative table, did not allow us to actually examine this with much detail. That's why in the univariate analysis, we had a significant result because of the bias to deferring the cataract surgery to a later date, which in the multiple logistic model was actually timed out, and we found that that did not play an important role. So what do we take home from this study? We found that if you do a primary cataract surgery, and then depending on the intraoperative clarity, and if you find that that is not very good and you defer the surgery to a second date, you can have a moderately good outcome. So removing the cataract lens in the same sitting is not mandatory. And prognostic factors that we found that was associated in this small series which affected the final visual outcome were the corneal tear that involved the visual axis and posterior segment complications. Thank you.
In the cases in which you had to remove the cataract at the same sitting as the trauma repair, did you have any criteria to decide whether to put an IOL, not to put an IOL?
If actually, that's why I said the bias, because we know that we have very good topical steroids and the anti-inflammatory drugs that we have are quite adequate. So we did the primary cataract surgery in only those cases where we had a very good intraoperative clarity. That was a very good cornea. So these injuries were actually smaller injuries, less severer injuries, and where there was no hypopyon, there was not much of iris prolapse, and where we could actually visualize the integrity of the posterior capsule. In only those we attempted to place it in the primary setting. Wherever the surgeons had a doubt, even if the corneal clarity was doubt because of the hyphema, or if the iris was not well organized, then we actually deferred the surgery. You can defer the surgery even if there is lens matter in the anterior chamber on the first operative day, and you can then take up the surgery on the, you can defer it for a couple of days, or maybe take it up the next week. As soon as the hyphema resolves and then the corneal edema resolves, you can wait. That correlation with timings was not presented in this study, but we had that kind of thing that you can wait for that thing. Don't have to operate it at the same time.
Same set. Okay. Any other question? Dr. Shukla has a question.
Well, in a case of trauma, there are so many factors which involve of ultimate outcome. And for information, we have got an International Society for Ocular Trauma, and Dr. Ferenc, who is the president, they have done a multi-center study in the United States about a very large number of cases, and they have given out a formula, which again is a rough guideline. And it's fairly accurate, it has been done in India also. The only flaw is that all that work was done in the United States. And so we cannot exactly compare in our country, so we are trying to do it here also. But there's already a good formula which gives you a fairly accurate what outcome could be in a given case. There are so many factors.
Yes, sir.
And this is a multi-setting analysis in the United States. So I think we refer to that would be a good study. Because there are so many factors, it's very difficult to be very accurate. The only flaw in that is that all that work is done in the United States, and it cannot be exactly compared with our country.
Yes, sir.
So we are trying to work out in our country also.
Because we have seen a patient with a very small corneal laceration in the periphery. We operate, we see that intraoperatively a good corneal clarity. We put in a lens, and for the first 2 to 3 weeks, patient does very fine. And then comes with a late fungal endophthalmitis. So that will again cut down on the outcome. Absolutely. Because with so many factors in trauma, you don't have to actually jump into the surgery on the first day for the cataract because of the good steroids.
Because so many secondary changes occur after some time.
Yes,
so
sir.
What you see initially, things will be very different after some time.
Yes, sir. Agree with you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First paper, yeah. So first paper, you're totally? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the session is concluded. If there is no other paper which is left out, or some authors who hadn't turned up, we still have time. If they have come now, no? Okay. Then give the judges 5-7 minutes. We'll come back to you.
Right from that direction.
Yeah. His first paper is...
all the presenters, the results will be announced in the valedictory. So it's immediately an hour after. That's the norms.
We just read the norms, printed norms here, that you're not supposed to announce. So my apologies for asking you to wait on, but we'll announce it in the valedictory, which will be a short time from now.
But all the presentations were very good, and thank you, and keep it up. There has to be one winner, of course, and everybody has presented very well. The topics of many were very interesting, some very innovative, so we'll take everything into consideration. Thank you.
Okay then, thank you very much.
You need to sign this.
Right.
All of us need to sign this. Anita is not here.
He says we should conclude with a song by me.
Devashish, you need to sign this. Fill in this.
Yes. All the best.
Well,
it was a very good presentation. We really appreciated it, and thank you.
Congratulations, sir.